Hey guys, welcome to Crater Mania. I'm your host, the man they call Crater, and I'm back again with my 500 movies in 2025 series. And for this week, this will be movies number 306 through 309. And as some of you may have noticed, I did get some new glasses I've been waiting on for a while. They finally came in the other day. So I figured I would show them off to you guys. Now, I really like them. They're really cool. They got like kind of a clear thing going at the bottom of the frames. Just really cool. I really like these. I think I'm going to pick me out some different frames as well. Just kind of have an extra pair from Zenny Optical here soon. So, but yeah, anyways, let's get into tonight's show. Let's not waste any time. So, on tonight's show, we're going to be talking about the House franchise. And the original film that we're going to be talking about first is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year. So, if I just did a stream recently, a couple weeks ago, of all these films from the year 1985 celebrating their 40th anniversary this year, as I have done several other films earlier in the year here on the channel. But here is yet again another film from 1985. And the original film that we're going to start off by talking about is one of my favorite horror comedies of all time. And, it's definitely my favorite out of the entire House series, and we'll get into that a little bit. I'll get into how I feel about all of the different House films this evening. So I guess let's just go ahead and start off with the first film, the one that started it all for this franchise. So, in that whole kaleidoscopic landscape, of 1980s horror, it was a decade that was just defined by, silent slashers and, demonic possessions and creature features, drenched in all this practical gore. And there were a few films that really dared to be different. And, you know, they those types of films that they understood that a scream could be followed by a laugh, and that terror and absurdity weren't mutually exclusive, but could in fact be perfect bedfellows, so to speak. And for those of us who cherish this strange and wonderful subgenre, which this horror comedy, there is one title, that really stands out as this kind of a foundational pillar, a very bizarre and just heartfelt, masterpiece that still resonates today. And that's Steve Miner's House from 1985. And like I said, I'm a longtime fan of just this entire, wonderfully inconsistent franchise. Revisiting the original film and its sequels really feels like, returning to that beloved, slightly decrepit and monster infested home. It's a franchise that never took itself too seriously, and in doing so, it created something truly special, in my opinion. Um, so, on the surface, House, presents kind of a familiar setup. Roger Cobb, who's played to perfection by William Catt here. Roger Cobb is this successful horror novelist. He's a man that's haunted by his past as well. So, he's grappling with this kind of severe PTSD from his time in the Vietnam War. He's going through this kind of painful divorce, and just this unsolved disappearance of his young son Jimmy. And following the apparent suicide of his aunt, Roger inherits this gothic like Victorian mansion. Um, and seeking solitude to kind of write this memoir about his wartime experiences, he decides to move into this house, and hoping that the isolation will cure his writer's block. And he soon discovers, though, however, that the house is far from empty. Um, and what separates House from its kind of haunted house contemporaries is, that masterful and just utterly unique tone that it has. This is not a film about subtle chills or lurking shadows. You know, this house is an active, malevolent, and just often um, darkly comedic, villain of the film. It doesn't just whisper; it screams, it attacks, it plays cruel jokes. One moment Roger is battling this grotesque, like skeletal bat creature that bursts from this closet, and the next, he's being taunted by disembodied garden tools floating in midair, or a big like taxidermy marlin like flopping up and down on his wall. Um, this film is a relentless fun house, of surreal set pieces, each more imaginative than the last. And who could forget, like that taxidermy marlin that I was talking about that just kind of wrenches itself from the wall to flop aggressively after him. And that's one of the most memorable things for me personally about this film. I always would laugh my ass off every time I would see that. Or you look at the monsters coming from the up from the chimney that tries to kidnap this child of this girl that Roger was on a date with. Um, but at its core, House is a deeply personal story. About confronting one's demons. Both literally and figuratively. The house becomes this kind of physical manifestation, of Roger's trauma. The jungle like portal to another dimension, in his medicine cabinet is a clear gateway, back to those horrors of Vietnam that he experienced. And the film's most terrifying monster here is probably Big Ben, played by Richard Mole. This he's this kind of hulking, zombified soldier, and he's a former comrade whom Roger was forced to leave for dead in Vietnam. And when Ben returns, he's hell bent on revenge. So the film's kind of subtext becomes its text, basically. To save his son, who has been taken into this house's netherworld, Roger must finally face the guilt and the trauma that he has just suppressed for so long. And this kind of emotional anchor, which is anchored by William Katt's kind of earnest and relatable performance, it really elevates House from this kind of simple monster mash into this kind of journey of redemption. It's scary, it's hilarious, you know, um, which thanks in no small part to George Wendt, as this kind of nosy, good natured neighbor Harold. Um, and it has this surprising amount of heart to it. Um, and to understand why House works so well, one has to look at its director, Steve Miner. By 1985, Steve Miner was already the seasoned veteran, of the horror genre, but not in the way that you might expect. He was a key figure in the Friday the 13th franchise. He haven't directed part two and part three. He knew how to build suspense and just deliver those effective jump scares. And crucially, the film was produced by Sean S. Cunningham, who was the director of the original Friday the 13th. And with that kind of pedigree, audiences could have easily expected a straightforward, bloody slasher, but instead, Steve Miner and Sean Cunningham, they kind of pivoted dramatically, using their horror credentials to create something that was far more, complex. And Steve Miner, he demonstrated just a kind of a deft hand for balancing, that wildly different, elements of the script. He could stage a genuinely tense Vietnam flashback, and in the next scene, direct this kind of slapstick fight with a closet monster without, giving the audience any kind of like whiplash or whatever. Um, so this kind of versatility, would become just a hallmark of Steve Miner's career, and he went on, to direct other genre blending hits like the supernatural action film Warlock. And he also did, the creature feature comedy Lake Placid. So, House really stands as a testament, to his ability to find the fun and fear and that humanity within the mayhem. Um, and just so the success that House had, it really spawned I think one of the most delightfully disjointed franchises in horror history. And unlike the kind of linear narratives of Halloween or A Nightmare on Elm Street, the House series is more of like an anthology, which is funny because like the next video I'm be doing after this one is going to be my tribute to horror anthologies, including the Creep Show films. But I'll talk about that more later. But like I said, yeah, the House series is more of like an anthology, with each film kind of offering a wildly different experience. Um, if you got House 2, the second story from 1987, abandoned horror almost entirely. The sequel leans into this kind of full blown fantasy adventure comedy, and it features new characters in a new house. The film follows this young man who unearths his great great grandfather, who is this gunslinging zombie, and he discovers a crystal skull that opens portals to prehistoric and Aztec worlds. It's a film with a prehistoric pterodactyl, a lovable caterpillar dog hybrid creature, and this an electrician turned Aztec warrior. It's pure unadulterated 80s cheese, and for fans who embrace that goofy charm, it's an absolute joy. And I'll talk a bit more about House 2 here in a little bit, but moving on, you got House 3 and House 4, and so I don't want to go too much into those right now. Like I said, I'm going to be covering all of these movies after I get done with this first film. But basically, just the legacy of House is twofold. First, it cemented its place as this kind of quintessential, cult classic. And it's a perfect getaway, or not getaway. What am I talking about? Well, yeah, it is kind of a getaway film. I mean, like, because it's one of those films, like, if I'm stressing out or something, and like, it's one of those films I could put on. It's going to make me feel better. But it's also a perfect gateway horror film, which is scary enough, to be thrilling, but fun enough to not be, traumatizing. It's celebration of kind of practical effects, from these creature designs to the puppetry. It really just makes it like a time capsule of this beloved era in filmmaking. And and second, it was this key player, and just popularizing that whole horror comedy subgenre, just proving that a film could be both and succeed. And like I said, the original House is one of my all-time favorite horror comedies. I feel like it's a film that doesn't get talked about enough from horror fans. It really walked this kind of tightrope that would influence countless films that would follow. Reminding us that sometimes the best way to deal with a monster in your closet is just to simply whack it with a broom and laugh. But in conclusion, that the House franchise is a beautiful mess. It's an unpredictable collection of films, that veers from heartfelt trauma to slapstick fantasy to a gritty slasher, but at its center, is this original film, is the 1985 original, film that just perfectly captured a unique moment in horror history. It's a film that understands that the scariest monsters are often the ones that we carry inside us. But a little bit of humor and a lot of courage can help us face them down. And I like that attitude about things. But and for fans like myself, House is more than just a movie. It's like I said earlier, it's that comfort food. It's a movie that I could put on if I'm not feeling great, and I'm instantly going to be in a better mood after watching this movie. It's a cinematic home or cinematic house, if you will, that we can always return to. Knowing that behind that creaking door, lies a world of spectacular imagination and genuine scares and just this enduring goofy heart about it. And I like I said, I absolutely love this movie, and just I feel like like I said, I don't think it gets talked about enough amongst horror fans, but definitely in the horror comedy subgenre is one of my absolute favorites. Um, but moving on to the second film in this franchise, House 2, the second story from 1987, which earlier I did find I have an old promotional pin of the movie. So I thought that was pretty cool. I thought I would share that with you guys. But and for fans, of the original movie that we just talked about, um, the when the announcement was made, back in the 80s of a sequel being made for, well, it was kind of met with a mixture of like excitement and trepidation from what I've seen online. Um, because the first film, it just kind of struck this perfect, almost impossible balance between genuine haunted house horror and laugh out loud comedy, and just this surprisingly poignant story of a man wrestling with his personal demons. It felt like lightning in a bottle with the original film. So how could you possibly replicate that? So the simple brilliant answer that House 2, the second story, provides is you don't. Instead of trying to recreate the original specific tone, the sequel kind of boldly carves its own path, trading that suspenseful horror for this high spirited fantasy adventure. And for some, this was kind of a jarring departure. But, for those of us who truly just love the strange and just wonderful universe that this franchise kind of inhabits, it was just an act of creative genius, in my opinion. That solidified the House series is one of the most unpredictable and joyfully weird properties of the 80s. And and at its core, House 2 is this kind of buddy comedy, wrapped in this fantasy adventure with this kind of Western revenge plot thrown in for good measure, all taking place within the walls of a just a magical dimension hopping mansion. And gone is that tortured, writer, hero of the first film that was Roger Cobb, and in his place, we have this kind of slightly naive Jesse, played by Ari Gross, and his fast talking, troublemaking best friend Charlie, played by Jonathan Stark, who you might know as Jerry Dandridge's familiar from the original Fright Night film. So Jesse has just inherited, his family's ancestral home, which is this kind of sprawling, gothic like architectural marvel of a mansion, that his parents were, just mysteriously murdered in years ago. So, while sorting through his family's history, Jesse and Charlie, discovered this old photo and this journal, detailing the exploits of Jesse's great great grandfather, who was this legendary adventurer, also named Jesse, and was laid to rest there on the property, clutching this kind of this mystical crystal skull with these regenerative powers. So naturally, our heroes, they decide the only logical course of action is to dig up Gramps. And what follows is the film's, I think, most iconic and tone defining sequence. So the reanimated corpse of Gramps, who is played with this immense charisma by Royal Dano, uh, isn't just this brain, isn't a brain, what am I trying to say? He isn't a brain eating ghoul, but he's a friendly, like a wisecracking, undead cowboy, and he's delighted to be back among the living. So he explains that the skull is this kind of source of incredible power, and that the house itself is kind of this nexus of time and space that's built over a Mayan temple. So this revelation transforms the film from a simple treasure hunt into this kind of dimension hopping quest. for Jesse and Charlie and Gramps. So the house becomes this kind of playground of just infinite possibilities. One room opens into a prehistoric jungle roamed by dinosaurs. Another becomes this kind of sacrificial Aztec temple. And Jesse and Charlie, along with Jesse's girlfriend Kate, and his record producer friend Lana, and and this hilarious kind of out of depth electrician turned adventurer named Bill, played by John Ratzenberger. Um, must navigate these kind of bizarre worlds. And before I go further, just speaking of the character of Bill, played by John Ratzenberger, it's just I always thought it was really cool because John Ratzenberger, who played Cliff Clavin in the Cheers TV show, um, and then you have George Wendt, who played Harold in the original House, was Norm on Cheers, and Norm and Cliff were always buddies, sitting there beside each other at the bar. So I really love how the House universe has a connection with the Cheers universe. But anyway, so they all encounter just kind of all these fantastical creatures, brought to life with glorious, practical effects, including, the impossibly adorable catter puppy, which it was a caterpillar with a dog's head, and then you have a baby pterodactyl and this caveman who they briefly adopt. And the central conflict arrives in the form of Slim Razor, who is Gramps' skeletal undead nemesis who wants the crystal skull for himself. So the film kind of culminates in this wild showdown that feels less like a horror movie finale and more like a supernatural like version of a classic Hollywood Western or something. Just proving that House 2 is a film that just absolutely revels in its own absurdity. And to understand why House 2 took such a radical turn, just take a look at the director here. So the film was helmed by Ethan Wiley, which is a name that should be recognizable to any diehard fan of the franchise. Wiley wasn't just some hired gun; he was the screenwriter of the original House. So this context is crucial. The tonal shift wasn't a studio mandated misfire or a misunderstanding, of the source material. It was a conscious, creative decision made by one of the series' key architects. And Wiley, having already explored the horror centric potential of the whole magical house concept, he chose to use the sequel to explore its more kind of fantastical possibilities. Um, and Ethan Wiley's background also informs the film's creature feature, sensibilities. He was part of the crew on Joe Dante's Gremlins, my favorite film of all time. That's a film that famously walked that whole tightrope between horror and comedy, and that whole Spielberg-esque adventure. You can see that DNA all over House 2. The focus on inventive, charmingly puppeteered creatures, and that lighthearted, almost kind of swashbuckling tone feel, like a direct extension of that school of filmmaking. And rather than trying to have Steve Miner's style, or to kind of like mimic his style, Ethan Wiley leaned into his own strengths, transforming that house from a place of this psychological dread into this gateway for just pure unadulterated fun. So this decision ensures that House 2, stands on its own 2 feet, just offering a completely different but just equally valid experience within the same universe. And while it may not be as critically lauded as its predecessor, the legacy of House 2 is significant, particularly for the franchise itself. Um, its greatest impact was establishing the House series as an anthology by completely changing the tone, the characters, and the subgenre. It really set this precedent that a house movie didn't have to be about a haunted house in the traditional sense. The house itself was the star here. This kind of a magical constant around which any kind of weird story could be told. Um, and this was a brave leap, that it kind of paved the way for the body horror Nightmare of House 3, and that kind of bizarre sci-fi tinged finale of House 4. And without House Two's kind of bold departure, the series might have devolved into a formulaic, rehash with each film. But furthermore, the film stands, as a glorious monument, I think, to the era of practical effects. In a world that's now dominated by a lot of CGI, there's a tangible magic to the creations in House Two. You got the Catter Puppy puppet, the stop motion skeletons, and the full body creature suits. They all have this kind of weight and personality, just that digital effects, don't often have. Um, and just this movie is just a masterclass in creativity on a budget. A testament to the artists and the puppeteers who just poured their hearts into making these these fantastical beings feel real. And for fans of '80s movies, it's a time capsule of a lost art form. Its lasting legacy is that of a beloved cult classic. A film that may have confused general audiences, but was just fiercely embraced by those who appreciate its fearless genre mashing and just that infectious sense of adventure. You know what I mean? But House Two, the second story, is not just a great sequel; it's a joyful anomaly. It's a film that had the courage um, to just defy expectations and deliver something just entirely new and wonderful. And for the fan who loves the House franchise for its kind of boundless creativity, um, and just its willingness, to be strange. This film is an absolute treasure. It takes that core concept of a magical house and just launches it, you know, into the stratosphere of fantasy and adventure. And I think that this one, House Two, is my wife's favorite. She talks about it when it comes to the House franchise. She talks about House Two more than any other film in the franchise. And I think a lot of that has to do with because it has that horror element to it, but it also has that fantasy element to it too. And she loves the Catter Puppy. That's I think one of her favorite creatures. In just any film. Like I think she thinks it's adorable. And my wife, she does a lot of like art pieces, especially like sculptures and stuff. And she's been talking about how she wants to make a Catter Puppy of her own. So I hope she eventually does do that. But yeah, like it's just this movie is just it's funny, it's imaginative and just endlessly rewatchable, and it's just kind of powered by all these charismatic performances and just the unforgettable practical effects, So, if the first House is a tense, clever horror comedy, then House Two is its exuberant adventure loving younger sibling. It may not be the story that that some were expecting, but for those of us who came along for the ride, it was and remains, I think, the perfect second story. Um, but now we move on to House Three, which it's mostly known. It's not known as House Three in a lot of places or by a lot of fans. It's mostly known as the horror show. Um, as a diehard fan of the House franchise, I often kind of found myself in that position of defending, the whole wildly inconsistent yet utterly charming identity of the franchise. This series is just a beautiful chaos of tones. The original House is that perfect blend of just genuine scares and Vietnam era trauma and that goofy creature feature fun. House Two is it switched out most of the horror in favor of that kind of fancy adventure with all the practical effects and with the catter puppy and a zombie Gramps. But though then in 1989, the franchise took this really hard left turn into this dark, blood-soaked, alleyway with House Three, the horror show. And just for decades, this film has been labeled like the black sheep, the imposter, the entry that doesn't belong. And this is so I want to try to make people think otherwise here. So it was released as the horror show in the United States and only branded House 3 internationally. And so it created this whole legacy of confusion just with its title. But I'm here to argue that this brutal, mean-spirited, and terrifying film isn't just a worthy entry, it's a misunderstood masterpiece of the late 80s in the horror genre. And I think just a testament to the franchise's kind of, fearless, if chaotic, creativity. So to understand why House 3 or the horror show, is so divisive, you gotta first, understand what it is and what it isn't as well. So this is not a film about a creaky old house with mischievous ghouls and comedic undertones. This is a gritty gut punch of a supernatural slasher. So the story centers on Detective Lucas McCarthy, who's played by the legendary Lance Henriksen, in this kind of raw and powerful performance from him. And McCarthy finally captures the that sadistically theatrical serial killer, Meat Cleaver Max, or Max Jinky, who's played by just an unforgettable Brian James. And just after this kind of chilling confrontation, McCarthy witnesses Jinky's um, execution in the electric chair, but not before the killer vows this terrible revenge on him. So Max Jenkins, I'm just going to call him Max. So Max, who's this just true monster who revealed in butchery, makes good on his promise. He returns from the grave not as a simple ghost, but as this kind of parasitic entity of pure electrical energy and malice. And he doesn't just haunt McCarthy's new suburban home. He invades it, just weaponizing the house's plumbing, electricity, just the very foundation against the family. So even more terrifying, he burrows into McCarthy's psyche, just kind of blurring the lines between reality and just this nightmarish hallucination. Like you have this Thanksgiving turkey, transforms into this, shrieking, decapitated version of Max, and then just the basement furnace becomes a gateway to this kind of hellish slaughterhouse. And McCarthy's grip on sanity starts to fray as he's tormented by visions and just brutally physical attacks, all while trying to protect his family, who believes that he's suffering from this kind of complete mental collapse. So the house of the title is no longer just a physical location. It's in McCarthy's mind, his family unit and just his very soul, all under siege from this unstoppable evil. And to appreciate the film's visceral direction, one's got to look at the director here as well, which is James Isaac. And while the horror show was his directorial debut, you know James Isaac was just no stranger to the craft of creating nightmares. He was just a seasoned special effects technician who had worked under people like Chris Wallace and most notably, I guess, David Cronenberg on films like The Fly. So this background, it was the key to unlocking the horror show. And James Isaac's expertise wasn't in comedy or character driven drama, it was in body horror and these kind of grotesque practical effects. So you can feel, David Cronenberg's influence dripping from every frame in this. The film is obsessed with the violation and mutation of the flesh. The gore isn't just for shock value; it's imaginative and upsettingly, even tangible. Um, the practical effects, from Max's kind of charred, electricity crackling form to the gruesome, hallucination sequences, they're really all the true star of the film, along with Max's laugh too, which is I can't I get I mean I know this movie is pretty serious as far as when it comes to the house movies, but I swear I think I laugh more at this film than I do any other house film, and it's because of Max's laugh. And he's like, or I can't even do it. It's like bizarre. If you if you don't know what I'm talking about, just go to YouTube and just look up Max Jenke's laugh from House 3, the horror show. It's so bizarre and it's so unique. Like it's very I mean, I can't help but to laugh at it. And it's used all throughout the film. Um, but so I would call that laugh the true star of this film. But like I said, James Isaac, he approached the movie not as a storyteller first, but as a visual artist of the horror. And this is why I think the film feels so relentless and visceral. Um, he understood how to an audience make an audience squirm, and he leveraged that skill to its absolute maximum. His career would later see him helm another iconic slice of genre fun, which we've already covered here on the channel, and that's Jason X. And that it proved that his knack for taking established franchises and bold, unexpected new directions. And I love Jason X. I know Jason X gets a lot of hate, but I love Jason X. Um, but the legacy of House 3, the horror show, uh, is once again twofold. On one hand, it's confusing. Branding permanently fractured the House franchise. Just the film's extreme tonal shift was so jarring that the next entry, House 4 in the Repossession from 1992, just completely ignored it and just kind of served as a direct sequel to the original film, which we'll get to that in just a little bit though. But for casual viewers, it House 3 remains just an anomaly. This kind of inexplicable detour into this very grimness that just doesn't fit. But I think for a lot of hardcore horror fans, that's precisely its appeal. It was stripped of the House 3 title in the US, and the horror show stands on its own as this kind of formidable piece of late 80s horror cinema. It's a time capsule from an era when horror was pushing boundaries and getting nastier and exploring darker themes. And so it sits comfortably alongside other mean spirited supernatural slashers like Wes Craven's Shocker and The First Power. And you know I've always thought that too, like that this movie is goes hand in hand with Wes Craven's Shocker. It would This movie and Shocker would be a great double feature for someone if you've never seen either of those films. But I think that this film's most enduring impact is that creation of Max Jenke. Brian James just delivers this all-time great horror villain performance. He's just utterly terrifying. He's charismatic, cruel, and just genuinely intimidating. And with that laugh, that cackle, that will echo in your mind long after you watch this movie. So, Max is not a sympathetic figure or a quippy jokester or anything. He's just a force of pure, unadulterated evil who delights in this psychological torture as much as he does physical violence. In a just world, Max would be mentioned in the same breath as Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees. I think and that's my opinion. Though I could see him definitely as this kind of A-list villain, and I feel like he's just unfairly dismissed as a B-list movie villain because House 3, The Horror Show, is a B-list movie. So that dynamic between, Lance Henriksen's kind of desperate hero and, Brian James's kind of gleeful monster is really electric. No pun intended. But, just it really creates this powerful, like, central conflict that really elevates the entire film. Um, but and so is House 3, the horror show, a good house sequel in the traditional sense? Not exactly, but because it discards that the established formula and just kind of stomps on the audience's expectations. Um, but that I think is precisely what makes it a brilliant piece of franchise filmmaking. It represents this kind of willingness to experiment, to take risk, and just to explore the darkest corners of the genre. And to be a fan of the House series is really just to embrace its kind of chaotic, shape shifting nature. The horror show is the ultimate expression of that chaos. It can be viewed on its own terms. It can be viewed just as a standalone film, away from the rest of the House franchise. So, and it's a magnificent horror film. It's relentless, gory, psychologically disturbing. It's just a thrill ride of a movie that is powered by these two phenomenal lead performances and just a director whose background in practical effects, resulted in some of the most creative and kind of wince-inducing, horror imagery of the decade. I think that this is a film that dares to be different, and for that, it should be celebrated, not shunned. I don't understand it. I think this is a great film, and for any House fan or lover of '80s horror, you know, I think it's time for you guys to stop treating House 3, the horror show, as a misstep and just start recognizing it for what it truly is. And I think it's the House franchise's like brutal and beautiful and just terrifying dark heart of the franchise. So please go into next time you watch House 3, the horror show, go in with it with that mindset. And maybe you'll look at it differently and appreciate it more, much like I do. But that now brings me to the last entry in this franchise, and that's House 4, The Repossession from 1992. And for fans of the House franchise, the journey through its four films, is kind of a masterclass in tonal whiplash, as we've talked about. We started with this poignant, inventive horror comedy about a Vietnam veteran, battling his personal demons, made manifest. And then, we're whisked away on this kind of goofy, crystal skull hunting adventure with House 2, the second story. And then the third entry, the horror show, just abandoned all pretense of comedy for a grim, mean spirited slasher that just only bears the House name in certain territories. It's a wild, inconsistent ride, and then there's the fourth and the final film, House 4, The Repossession. Often dismissed, frequently ridiculed for one particularly infamous scene, and just largely forgotten by mainstream horror audiences. House 4 is, in my eyes, um, a really misunderstood film, and I think it's criminally underrated. It's a film that just bravely attempts to return to the heart of the original, providing this kind of somber, heartfelt, and just, you know, fittingly bizarre conclusion to the saga of the Cobb family and their malevolent magical home. And at its core, House Four is just the true thematic sequel to the 1985 original. It brings the story back to where it all began. The house itself and the family that was cursed to inhabit it. So the film opens with this tragedy that directly informs the entire narrative. So Roger Cobb, again, played by the magnificent William Catt, he was the hero of the first film, and now he's driving with his new wife Kelly, and their young daughter Laurel, and suddenly there's this violent car accident that kills Roger and leaves Laurel paraplegic, confined to a wheelchair. So Kelly and Laurel, they're forced to relocate for financial reasons, and they have no choice but to move into this old, ominous family home that Roger had inherited, which is the very same house that tormented him, years ago. So here, the film kind of masterfully layers its threads. On one hand, we have the supernatural. The house is waking up again with strange noises, ghostly apparitions, and just reality bending events that primarily target the vulnerable Laurel and Roger's wife Kelly. But unlike the first film where the horror was this externalization of Roger's PTSD, the house here feels more like a wounded protective entity stirred by this kind of new tangible evil. Um, so this brings us to the human villain, who makes the film so much more compelling than a simple haunted house retread. So Roger's um, conniving, evil half brother Burke is determined to get Kelly out of this house. His motives are not just simple greed. He's a part of this scheme to use this land as an illegal dumping ground for toxic waste. So this kind of environmentalist subplot, while very early '90s in its execution, gives the film a kind of grounded, contemporary menace. And Burke's campaign of gaslighting and intimidation, against this grieving widow, is genuinely cruel. Making him a villain that you truly despise. Um, so the film becomes this kind of two front war for Kelly. She must protect her daughter Laurel from this increasingly like aggressive supernatural forces, within the house, while simultaneously fighting off her malevolent, brother-in-law who wants to just poison the land and steal her home. So the narrative kind of brilliantly ties these threads together, suggesting that the house's spiritual energy, rooted in sacred Native American spring beneath it, is reacting violently to the threat of Burke's toxic pollution. So Roger Cobb, he returns in flashbacks and kind of as this spectral guide throughout the film, helping his family from beyond the grave, and just which makes his presence, a very comforting, although tragic, you know, um, I can't even think of the word I'm trying to say. Um, kind of damn it, like I just had a brain fart. But you know what I'm trying to say. Like he just his presence is a very comforting, and although tragic, he's just there to still help his family. And yes, it's the movie with the demonic talking pizza, which is played by Kane Hodder, which I have gave him shit about in the past, just messing around with him. But But to reduce the film to that single, absurd moment is, I think, to miss that, kind of sincere, somber family drama at its heart. And Helm in this final chapter was Louis Abernathy, and this is a name that might not be as recognizable as a Toby Hooper or a Wes Craven, but his background made him uniquely suited, I think, for this project. His roots are firmly planted in the world of practical effects and creature design and underwater cinematography. He was a writer on the creature feature Deep Star Six, and perhaps I think most impressively, served as this kind of key consultant and submersible expert for James Cameron on both The Abyss and Titanic. So this kind of technical hands-on expertise, shines through in House 4. While the budget was just clearly, lower than its predecessors, um, Abernathy leans into that kind of tangible, physical effects. The house doesn't just creak. It's plumbing groans and spews black sludge, and the ghostly manifestations feel very physical. And of course, that infamous pizza, um, like pizza ghost, pizza puppet, whatever you want, scene is just, I think, a testament to that charm of practical effects, and all that kind of wizardry. Um, but Abernathy, he understands that horror is often most effective when it's something you can almost touch. His direction grounds the supernatural in this kind of grimy physical reality that feels consistent with the original film's aesthetic. He doesn't try to replicate that slick, high concept horror of the era, but instead, delivers a film um, that feels like a lost artifact, from the mid '80s, even though this was released in the early '90s, and it kind of prioritizes the atmosphere and those scares over jump scares and gore. Um, so House Four's legacy, I guess, is one of quiet completion. While House Two is a fun, unrelated adventure, House Four serves as kind of the definitive end of the Cobb family's story. It dares to ask what happens after the hero of the first film tries to live a normal life. That answers tragically is that the house and its legacy are inescapable. By killing Roger Cobb off, and off screen, the film makes this bold statement that this isn't his story anymore. It belongs to the women that he left behind, forcing them to confront this same darkness that he once did, but on their own terms. And I think, the film's greatest impact is how it recenters the franchise's emotional core. It's about grief, trauma, and just that fierce, resilience of a mother protecting her child. And Terry Trias, who plays Kelly, gives this powerful and sympathetic performance. She's a woman that's stripped of her life with her husband. And she's here. She's got to find a new source of strength to survive. And the film's focus on her struggle is, I think, one of the film's most enduring qualities. And furthermore, the environmental angle, while a bit dated, it really adds this kind of unique flavor that really sets it apart from the other House films. You know, the house in House Four becomes a symbolic battleground. Not just between good and evil, but between nature and corrupt industry. The spirit in the house is no longer just a malevolent force. It's a guardian spirit of the land itself. Fighting back against those who would defile it. So this kind of really adds this layer of just unexpected depth. And I feel like that's why this movie is very underrated. You know, and let's be honest, the whole pizza scene with the wisecracking threats and everything is really earned its place in the world of just wonderfully weird horror moments. One that I'll definitely never forget. It's I think it is that perfect encapsulation, of the House franchise's signature blend of just genuine creepiness and just utter absurdity. And its cult status, I think, is well deserved. Um, but House Four, the Repossession, it's not a perfect film by any means. Its budget limitations are apparent, and its tone occasionally wobbles between serious family drama and campy creature feature. But like I said, for a fan of the franchise, it is an essential, I think, and deeply satisfying final chapter. It's a film made with this kind of sincere appreciation um, for what made the original so special. That blend of horror and heart and just unapologetic weirdness. It bravely brings the story full circle. Just offering the kind of this poignant send off to Roger Cobb. While passing the torch to his family. And it's a film that deserves, I think, to be reevaluated. Not as the silly sequel with a talking pizza, but as this worthy, um, somber and surprisingly emotional bookend to I think, one of the '80s most unique horror series, in my opinion. It closes the door on the Cobb family, and their home for good, and it does so with this kind of strange, um, it's heart in the right place. But yeah, so definitely, like I said, give this whole franchise a shot. I mean, the first film is amazing, and most people that I've talked to that know about these movies absolutely love the first House, and then the same with the House Two, the second story. But I've noticed with a lot of people that I've talked to and fans online that House 3 and House 4 are kind of like the redheaded stepchilds, redheaded stepchildren of the House family. But I'm just saying, go in with it with a different perspective next time you watch these films, and see if you like them any better, have any more appreciation for them, this time around. But guys, I know we're not even an hour in on this stream, but I just want to try to keep this one short tonight. I know I kind of zoomed through all those reviews of the House franchise, but I do have to get in bed early tonight, unfortunately, because I do got a big day at work tomorrow. Um, my wife Candace is actually starting with me at my job, and so tomorrow will be her first day. So we're going to go in together, go in there early. I'm probably going to be waiting around for a while for my shift to begin because she's got to go in a little bit earlier than I do. But I just want to thank everyone who either watched this live, and if you were in the chat. Um, just want to thank you guys for checking out this stream, checking out what I have to say about these films. Like I said, I really do appreciate you watch this live or you watch this on the replay. Please drop me a comment below on what your favorite of the House franchise is. If you've seen any or all of these films, just let me know which one's your favorite. Tell me why. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate that. Um, and if you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button down below to catch more videos from me like this one. So the next video I got coming up is my tribute to horror anthology. So that's going to be on Tuesday night. Be sure to check that out. And as always, click the bell for any future notifications, so that way you don't miss an episode here on Crater Mania. But with all that said, I'm Crater. This is Crater Mania. I love you guys. Have a good night.